Hey, thanks for watching. This is James with WorkSpace. We are going to do a review of this lease agreement here for the center at Kirby Ridge. This review is from a commercial real estate broker. The advice here is on the business points of a lease only. I am not a practicing attorney, so I cannot give legal advice. So if there are legal questions, we will refer those questions to an attorney. As far as the business points, and we're talking about the market points of a deal, just the raw business points of this lease, we're going to go into detail. So this is going to be a boring video. I'm going to try to make this as interesting as possible and as concise as possible. But at least when you watch this, you're going to know an explanation of every point that I recommend here, and you can rewatch if you have any questions before we start talking. So let's get into it. So starting out, all of the points here look good. The tenant address, this will be the address when it is developed here. The trade name, that's your trade name, that's correct. And the Jack is the agent here. So permitted use is a fitness center, all indoor training. That's important because what they're saying is they don't want you to do anything outside the fitness center. So if you do need to do something outside the fitness center, we need to make an adjustment here for permitted use. And we also need to elaborate on that in the language later on in the lease here. The device premises, all of this looks good. The square footage looks good. When they say the proportionate share of the shopping center being 10.4%, that means that for the purposes of your triple net cost, for determining what your common area maintenance, taxes, and insurance would be as far as your share, they're saying you're 10.4% of the building. Okay, so that means you have 10.4% of the taxes, 10.4% of the insurance, 10.4% of the common area maintenance. As far as the lease term being here on June 1st, that is a safe date. They will obviously let you move in earlier if rain permits construction to move quickly. But June is a date that the landlord feels like, hey, we know we can get them in at this date. So we need to discuss that. If you absolutely have to be in 2-3 months before this date, we need to consider what your other options may be. If you can wait for June or maybe a month early, this is something that should be very, very reasonable to achieve. Now on the rental clause here, you can see that they deleted the percentage rent increase here, and I'll explain that. The language that's stricken here is the rental adjustments based on the CPI or Consumer Price Index. There are a few landlords that try this method, but they essentially want to keep up with inflation and raise your rental rate based on that. That's all stricken, so we don't really have to get into too much detail. Just know that on this boilerplate that they had, this is one option that they had in the boilerplate, but they already struck it out. And if they didn't strike it out, we would certainly try to do that as well, since we've already negotiated rates that are reasonable. For the security deposit here, we need to get an explanation on what this assigning cost is, so we can put that into the calculations to make sure that the security deposit is correct. I'm not sure what they mean with 6,000 plus 1,000 due assigning. Okay, so in section 2.4, they are essentially explaining what the definition of the landlord, the construction being finished, is. Not only that, but they're also saying that landlords shall not be deemed to be in default hereunder or otherwise liable in damages to the tenant. That's in the event that the work is not completed on time. So the non-legal definition basically means, look, if something happens where we don't finish on time, you can't put the landlord in default and potentially sue him or try to exit out of the lease. And by the same token, if your construction guy does not finish on time, there should be language here that says that you guys won't be in default for that, and there's going to be some flexibility allotted. Okay, section 3.1 and 3.2 look fine. There is no prior tenant in 3.2, so we don't have to worry about that language here. Section 4.2, your rent's due on the first of the month. Section 4.3, your rental payment, if it's not received within 10 days, then you have a $150 charge here. Section 4.4, partial acceleration. gives the landlord the right, if you miss 2 months or you're late on payments in 2 months, the landlord, at their sole discretion, by giving written notice to the tenant, can accelerate your rent to pay every quarter. So they can make you pay every quarter instead of every month in order to try to get the payments more consistent. Section 4.5 is for the landlord. They're saying that if the landlord cannot obtain financing for the build out, then it would terminate this lease. Okay, that the landlord should have the right to cancel this lease. Okay, and so you can read this language. We can talk to Jack. Jack has specified specifically that he has a great relationship with his bank. He also has a construction crew that has a relationship with that bank. So it is very unlikely that they will not be able to not obtain financing. But if they did not obtain financing, then they would have an out here. And that's not something I recommend we change, because I think that would be essential for the deal since they develop a lot of properties. The way that I read this language on section 5.1, when you pay a security deposit, if there's an obligation for the tenant where the tenant does not fulfill their obligation, the landlord can take from your security deposit and draw on that. Here's an example. Let's say that you had a door issue or there was a problem that you were responsible for in your particular premises, your suite. The landlord would say, hey, can you cover that cost? If you refused, they can go in and pull from that security deposit and then come back and ask you to kind of refill that security deposit to the original amount. All right, and if you didn't do that, then you would be under default. That's pretty common in a lot of Houston leases that we see. So there's nothing that I'd want to change here. Let me look at this again real quick. It's also important to note that after the lease is done, the security deposit will be returned to the tenant within 30 days after the expiration date. So the only things that we could possibly tweak here, which I don't recommend we do, we could put some time limits here to when and how you would have to pay back this obligation. But again, this particular clause is pretty common. If there's an obligation for you to pay for something that's clearly written in this lease, it's going to be the landlord's expectation that you do it. And any attempt to try to block that is just, it's really a lot of unnecessary tension because it's not something the landlord's going to do willingly. It hobbles them. There's no reason for them to restrict that particular part of the language. I can tell you that from the landlord side. So I would rather use our leverage on something else besides the security deposit clause. I think it's fine. Section 6.1 deals with everything with common area. That's going to be your parking lot, your lights, your, let's see, it says private street alleyways, landscaping, curbs, loading areas, sidewalks, lighting facilities, drinking fountains, and the like. So that's common area. And this just articulates that. Section 6.2, 6.3 are fine. When we get to common area maintenance, this explains what your CAM charges are going to be. So if you have questions on what is CAM, and that's part of your triple net cost, common area maintenance, taxes, and insurance. If you want to know what common area maintenance is specifically, this will dictate that for you. And just to itemize it, it's lighting, trash removal, painting, cleaning, policing, inspecting, repairing, replacing, and let's see what else. And there's sometimes a capital improvement charge that comes up, but that's not covered in this clause. It'll be later, so let's look out for that in a sec. Section 7.1, it just restates that, hey, if we gave you this lease for a fitness center, we want you to use it for a fitness center. You can't use it for anything else. So if you start changing your business model, they're going to have an issue with that. And that's mainly to keep things nice and neat and to keep tenants from competing against each other too much. So you're going to be the gym here. We're going to make sure there's an exclusivity clause, so you are the only gym that's allowed here. And they're going to do the same for other types of tenants. So this just protects both parties. 7.2, keep your insurance requirements. 7.3, you can't do going out of business, fire sales. It detracts from the property. It hurts other tenants. Section 7.4, you need to keep things neat. 7.5, it pretty much tells you how you can display things in your window. 7.6, more advertising restrictions there. And 7.7 deals with the obligation being on you to get any permits and licenses required for business in Pearland. Now, Section 8 here goes into details on the obligations of the landlord and the tenant for repair of the premises. Generally speaking, the landlord is responsible for everything outside of the four walls. The tenant is responsible for everything inside of the four walls. And as you can see here, it says the landlord shall keep the foundation, exterior walls, except for the glass. You got the doors, the closure devices, other exterior openings, windows, door frames, molding, locks, hardware, storefronts, lighting, HVAC, mechanical and electromotive installation equipment, signs, place cards, and decorations or advertising media of any type, and interior painting or other treatment of exterior walls and the roof. So those are the obligations of the landlord. Okay, so I just added some quick language here. The landlord obligations are fine, but they put here, the landlord shall not be responsible in any way or for failure to make repairs until a reasonable time has elapsed. Reasonable can be open to interpretation. So what we want here is to have a date. I put 30 days, and they may push to 60. The point is that we have a hard date here and not just have it wide open. For us, however, we want to keep ours open as possible. Believe me, they've already put enough restrictions. I don't need to specify anything on this section here. But just so you know, your obligation is to keep the premises in a clean and habitable condition. And you're supposed to do the rodent control, pest control, and repair the glass. Basically, do the things inside the four walls that's listed here. Section 9.1 basically says that you can't make any alterations to the premises without consent from the landlord. So if there are any signs or anything other than signs that you want to do here, we need to articulate that in Section 9.1. So be sure to let me know before we send this copy over to the landlord. Section 9.2 just governs the rules in which the construction work will be done. That won't be an issue in this case because both your construction crew and Jack's are going to be bonded and everything else. I'm sure that will be fine here. Section 10.2, I changed the time period here from 90 to 30 days. What this section explains is that the landlord has the right to enter your premises and put a for lease sign when your lease is up, 90 days before your lease expires. I put this to 30 days just because, you know, nobody wants to operate their business with a for lease sign on the window. Most of the time, the landlords don't do this at all. Sometimes I try to remove it completely. But with Jack, and sometimes the landlord doesn't do this at all. They just want the right to do it. So I think we can just bump it to 30 days. And if you're wrapping up shop here, I think that's reasonable. But if you want to just strike it all together, let me know. Personally, I think that if we just put it to 30 and see what happens, it gives us a better position to use our leverage in a place that's more valuable. Okay, so for section 11.1, we need to go to Exhibit E for all the rules governing how your sign needs to be made and all of the rules around that. It's also important to note that without the landlord's written consent, you can't make changes to the storefront and install exterior lighting, erect or install any signs or any of the type that's listed here. So make sure to read this if you want to know the rules regarding what your sign can be like. What I suggest that we do here is to get your sign and to get the template and all of the marketing items that you want to display, and let's get that in the document so I can send it to the landlord to get his approval in writing. We will integrate that into the lease so we don't have any problems. Section 12.1 says you can't keep gas or butane on the premises. That should not be a problem for you since you're a gym and not an industrial use. Section 12.2 states that electricity, water, and gas is the tenant's responsibility as well as telephone service. So make sure that you account for that in your budget. Section 12.3 says that the landlord's not responsible if utilities are cut off or if there's an act of God that stops utilities from reaching the premises. So in short, the landlord doesn't want you coming to them saying, look, I want out of my lease because my gas is off for 5 months. They're going to say here that that's not our responsibility. It's not our fault. We still want you to stay here and pay rent. Now, how this plays out in actuality, there has been some floods where tenants have had the premises pretty much destroyed. There's other clauses that take care of this further down the lease. But if you have something small to where if the gas is off for a month or two, the landlord does not want you using that as an excuse. If there's a more severe problem or a force majeure or act of God that's listed here, there's going to be another part in this lease that should address that. So I'm going to go into more detail when we get to that section. Okay, so section 13.2, public liability insurance. They're asking for a $1 million, $2 million aggregate, which is fine, and let's see, $500,000 policy for property. So this is good. This is in line with, actually, it may be pretty low for a gym. It's great for smaller businesses with less traffic. So I want to keep the numbers here because if they adjusted this for what a gym should be, those numbers would probably be higher. So we're okay with this language and those requirements. Now, the landlord's saying in section 14.1 that he's not liable for injury to the property caused by the premises or other portions of the structural elements here. So this articulates what the landlord's not liable for. So you have to lean on your insurance if there is an incident here. I wouldn't trust the landlord's insurance. Your insurance needs to be clearly defined on what protects you and your patrons for your business. So if you have questions, we could talk about that, or give those questions to your insurance provider, and he can definitely articulate that for you. Okay, so section 15.2 covers that issue I talked about before where there's an act of God. So the landlord's saying here that if there's something that substantially damages the property, such as a fire, if 50% of the floor area was damaged, the landlord's saying that they have the option to give you a written notice within 60 days of the occurrence of this. They call it casualty, and they can elect to build the spot again, or you have the right to terminate the lease. I'm sorry, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease, but we're going to add language that we also have the right to terminate the lease here. Okay, so I added some language here, and their attorney is going to massage this. I just put the outcome that we want here, and we're going to let their attorneys, or your attorney if you wish, to put the proper language here so it can be massaged. But the point is that we want the option to terminate this lease if you can operate inside the premises for a set period of time. And I put 30 days. They will respond with probably 60 or 90 days, but we'll cross that bridge. We just want the language here to start the conversation. So 15.3 is important. When we look at restoration work, sometimes the landlord, let's say if there is a problem like this, and we saw this during the flood recently for some landlords in certain markets, where they'll fix the exterior shell, but the tenant is responsible for, in many cases, the build out on the inside. So this is where your insurance is very important. Make sure that you have insurance that covers you so that when the landlord, if this ever happened, if the landlord repairs the shell, your insurance, you want to cover all of your good stuff inside, including the ability to rebuild the layout that you had. So restoration work here is saying that you're responsible at your sole cost and expense to restore, repair, and replace basically all the build out that's there. That's pretty common. You just want to make sure it's insured. I think that we're doing great with the fact that they're doing the build out in the first place, but we want to make sure we insure it. So I do want to point that out for 15.3. 15.4 says here that there is an abatement period. So if they're building the space back in a case of an act of God, that there's going to have abated rent. So we're going to add here that we also shouldn't have to pay triple net cost. I want to see if we can get away with that. I'd rather you not pay anything during that time period. So let's go ahead and put that in there. Okay, so here we added language. Again, this is not the legal language I'm putting in. It's kind of a placeholder of what we want to have done here. Triple net charges shall be abated along with the base rent until construction is completed. The way it was written, they were going to negotiate a reasonable rental rate for you in the case that there was an act of God. And if you can't occupy the space, we don't want you paying any rent whatsoever. And also, if there's an act of God, we want you to pay no triple net cost because you're not making money yourself. So if we can help it, their bank may stop this, but let's try to get that done. This is one of those things that there's a 99% chance it won't happen. But if it does, you'll be better off for it. So I want to go ahead and put that in there. Section 16.1 says that if 30% or more of the property is taken by the government, then this lease will terminate. I've never seen that happen though. The rest of 16.2 to 16.4 just shows the situations and how things would work if part of the premises was taken, if part of the common area was taken, and how condemnation would happen. So you can review that if you want more details. Okay, so for section 17.1, this is something we always put in for our clients. It says here that consent is required to sublease the space. That's not a problem. But it doesn't have here that the landlord will not just flat out deny anyone that you ask. So we want to make sure we have a language in here that says the landlord shall not unreasonably withhold the right to sublet the premises. So if you want to get out of this lease and we find a tenant that has good credit, it's reasonable to allow them to replace you. So we want that clause there to protect you and your ability to sublease this space if you need to. You can refer to 17.2 and 17.3 if you're going to sublease. There's nothing in here that's unusual from what I see in the market. If you have questions about it, because this is becoming a long video, so if you have questions, I can break this down. Okay, so section 19.1. This is what happens if you can't pay rent and there's a default. So I want you to read this. This language is always oppressive. It's pretty normal. I shouldn't say normal. This is consistent with other leases that we've seen. The default clauses here, there's nothing out of the ordinary compared to other retail leases, is what I'm saying. So what I want you to do is to take a look at this and let me know what points out, if there's any pain points specifically that we need to tweak. We can discuss that with your attorney, or I can give you some other examples of what other clients have done, and we can look at that legal language to see if what you're asking to change is reasonable or not. And based on that, we can determine next steps. This is the section where the attorneys love to dig in, from my experience. And it's important. If there was a default procedure, this is how things would go down. So I want you to understand how that works. We want to avoid that by subleasing the space if we had to. And just understand, in some cases, the landlord negotiates something a little different in order to not take this to court. So we can discuss that later on how I think things could work with these particular landlords. But it's important to know how the lease says things are supposed to work out. Okay, so section 21.1 with holdover. This is saying that, let's see. Okay, so holdover is going to be 100%. That means that your rent's going to double if you stay in this lease and your lease expires and you don't negotiate a new deal. The rent will double. So that means that they don't want you operating outside of your lease. Just make sure we have a new lease negotiated before your lease expires. It's no cause for concern here. I don't think there's a reason to change that. You're not going to operate in this space without a lease, so that's going to be irrelevant for you. Okay, so section 26.1 shows that I'm your broker, and it shows the commission is 4% of the gross rents here. So that's all that's standard. But it says who your broker is and how much we get paid. Okay, so here is the site plan. So we can see there's only one building that's here. There's your storm drainage here. That's your lot. So that's a nice size lot. Nice size lot. There's a playground. So there's obviously going to be a daycare or something here. That's good. There's going to be a lot of working moms that are going to come into the center if the playground's here. I like that. That's going to be great for the other tenants there. Meets and bounds is just a legal description of the premises. Exhibit E is your sign criteria. Now this addendum shows you the actual rent schedule here. Okay, point 2 shows you what the landlord is going to build out. And this is your guarantee. So this shows that you're going to personally guarantee this lease. When I was looking at this, I didn't see anything that was inconsistent with other personal guarantees that I've seen in this market. So I don't have any recommendations on business points that we need to change here. Okay, so I tried to make that a short video. It still ended up being 25 minutes. So if you made it to the end of this, you're awesome. Just so you know, it takes a lot longer than that to read through this, and this is probably one of the biggest value adds I think that we can do for our clients is actually reading through this and being able to discuss what points may be important so you guys can understand it. Because once you sign it, it's too late. Once you sign it and you have to live with this, there's no walking back. So I think it's better to understand what's going on here and be able to sign with confidence. So please watch this video, scan over the lease, ask me any questions you want, and let's figure out what other changes you want to make on this document so that we can send this over to Jack. I'm looking forward to talking to you soon.